I may kindly ask you to please take your seats, mindful that we have an online audience that is waiting for us to please get settled. I do appreciate your kind attention. Thank you so much. If you're still upstanding, if I may kindly ask you to please take your seats. I do appreciate your kind attention. At this moment, allow me to welcome you back from a very short break, but a well-deserved break, and welcome you to our second session for the day, which is all about the circular economy for climate and nature. Before I proceed and before I introduce our next moderator, I'm going to ask the room to settle once again. And I'm going to welcome back our online audience, and I'm going to thank you very much for staying with us. From all corners of the world, thank you very much for staying with us. And we're very excited to be together here in Kigali. So please forgive us if we take a little bit of time just to get settled and back into the room. But we certainly want to get the program on the road. This session, ladies and gentlemen, which is all about circular economy for climate and nature, is going to be led by an incredible moderator. She is the Managing Director looking after Africa and global partnerships at the World Resources Institute. She comes into this conversation with over 20 years of experience advocating for social and environmental change on both local and international platforms. Over the years, she has also served really important strategic and advocacy roles, raising the prominence and visibility of global issues such as climate change, youth leadership, sustainable energy, and landscape restoration. And so with that, won't you kindly please join me with a round of applause for Wanjira Matai as she comes up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. What a beautiful venue, what a beautiful stage. I love this forum just because of how colorful and how vibrant it is. It just simply reminds us that the circularity is not about one thing or another. It's all over. It's around us. It's everywhere. Before I get started, I want to welcome you once again to this forum. I remember attending, I think it was a year ago or two. It was fully virtual, and then it was hybrid, and it's so nice to be back in person, and especially here to Kigali, one of my favorite places in the world. And one of the reasons I love this city so much is the issue of dignity. And circularity is also about dignity. And that's why this session on climate and nature as it relates to circularity is so important. So we're going to hear a little bit about key takeaways from COP27. I'm sure many of us have been processing since. And then, of course, look at circularity as a driver of Africa's economic development, which is something we must look at because it's about forward-looking. And we have so many debates. We were having one just a few minutes ago around the same thing. But before I start on a few opening remarks, there's a poll that's going to be launched. I hope it comes up right here. And we're going to ask two questions. One, how satisfied are you with the outcome of COP27? According to you, was it one, very successful, or very unsuccessful, and 5, the highest, if you felt it was hugely successful? And then what was the most successful thing in your view? This will be a word cloud, so just put one word to represent what you thought. So there are the questions, and as I speak, I hope you will be going on and answering that question as thoughtfully as you can, because in many ways it will shape how our discussion goes on. Now we know, as you do that, the deal struck in Sharm el-Sheikh acknowledged, quite frankly, the urgency of climate action in addressing the challenges, particularly around food and energy, which are two of the issues in particular that pertain to circularity. But we have a long way to go. The outcome also showed us that we have a long way to go. Political will did deliver a few big steps forward in addressing the impacts as pertains to loss and damage, but we also saw simultaneously a very split decision that did not inspire that much awe, that essentially fossil fuels remain at the center of our lives, and there did not seem to be the political will we saw with loss and damage on the issue of grappling with where we are going with emissions, and particularly in the highest emitters among us. We're simply just not doing enough. But the science is clear. We know that the science has been absolutely clear that every fraction of a degree that we push will also push the limits on our ability to adapt. Think about that. It is much easier, cost-effective to adapt today than it will be the longer we wait. So if we're unable to raise the financial and political will now, it's only going to get harder. Now, the request, of course, for a doubling of finance didn't make it to the agenda, but we did see a few steps forward, reflecting on the urgency on the need to support adaptation. So we have an opportunity, clearly, to act now, but the window is very, very short. We also know that addressing climate adaptation is the most cost-effective thing. And actually, for me, what makes that exciting is that investing in circular economy is also about adaptation. It's about how, it's at the heart of how we actually get there. And if you had told me that food systems, for example, would be the common denominator in the 3 key crises we are facing today, I would not have believed you. That the fact that climate change, biodiversity loss, and the rising levels of poverty and inequality all have food in common in one way or another, that has got to give us pause. 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions coming from our food systems, how we manufacture fertilizers, how we produce our food, how we package, how we process, how we transport, how we retail. All of those things, and not to even mention food waste itself. So all of that, a key part of how climate and our circularity are connected. Then you look at biodiversity, and the food story there is not that inspiring either. Food production has driven biodiversity loss and habitat loss essentially to the edge. We are clearing forests, wetlands, and grasslands at speedy rates. That too, an area we need to think more circularly about. And then, of course, on nutritional and food security, insecurity actually, this continues to rise. And it always saddens me that those who hold the food baskets, particularly in Africa, are smallholder farmers who are the custodians of food baskets, are the hungriest and they're the poorest. Something about that is deeply unjust. And that is another area where we know adopting more circular food systems, adopting traditions and indigenous knowledge that comes from the heart of these communities could inform the key principles of circularity, particularly in food systems. So I'm really proud to be here. I hope all of you, if not most, have read that wonderful report that was published by the World Resources Institute, my organization, in partnership with the government of Rwanda, the Cleaner Production Climate Innovation Center. We're very proud to be working with them, PACE, the Africa Circular Economy Network, Resonance, and of course, our financing partners, IKEA. I hope you look at that, because there are 2 key messages out of that. We have got to accelerate growth in circularity if we're going to make a difference, and the role of private sector centrally important in that as well. So I want to stop there and say that the idea of circularity, since we're here in Africa, and I'm really grateful, Citra and others, that this conference is held here in Kigali, because the idea of circularity in Africa, and I'm sure many of the speakers who came before me may have mentioned, is not new. Most of us grew up with circularity around us in many ways, and I always think that perhaps the more sustainable futures that we seek, the more the genius of circularity itself is coded in indigenous wisdom, is coded in indigenous cultures, and is coded in the very soil. I'm always struck by the fact that we use that expression of the circularity of life, dust to dust, because it is, after all, the ultimate in circularity. So thank you very much. I want to stop there and look at our poll results first and see what you thought, what you're doing. Somewhat unsatisfied. Those are the safe ones. 43% said they were. How satisfied are you with the role of circular economy at COP27? Somewhat unsatisfied. I think that's good because we have to be critical. We have to look for granularity. These are the last 6 years of this critical decade of action. So somewhat unsatisfied and somewhat satisfied will hopefully get us there. The next question we saw was, what was most successful in your view? Let's see, one-word responses. Ta-da! Adaptation. How amazing. So true. So true. This is the most important word as we move forward in the next 6 years of this great decade. So adaptation, I hope we keep that in our minds. Thank you all very much for participating in that. I now want to introduce a video that was produced by youth activists from Fridays for the Future. Take a look. No video. No video from Fridays for the Future. It's not Friday. Okay. All right, so we will move straight into our first panel. And this is going to carry on from what we just saw in the poll, essentially. What are the key takeaways from COP27 for Africa? It was an African COP, and a lot was made of the fact that it's an African COP not because of the geographic location, but because of the issues that pertain to Africa. So I want to have this discussion with two incredible women. Adriana Zacharias, she's the deputy head of the 10-year framework of program and sustainable consumption and production patterns at UNEP. Welcome, Adriana, and Davina Uwela, and she's the AFDB NDC Hub representative. Ladies, welcome. One here, one here. Lovely. Okay. Well, I think I'll start by letting you share your thoughts on that question first, and then we'll have a discussion. Shall we start with you, David?
All right. Thanks, Wanjira. Thanks, audience, honorable guests. What I can say, I'm Rwandan and happy to welcome you all. So on the topic today, takeaways from COP27, I did try to do a word search on circular economy. I wasn't very successful, but I also remember at the African Development Bank that when we were first introduced to circular economy, which is only 3 years ago, we actually did a word search in our program and didn't find much. When we dug deeper, we found that we actually do a lot. And so just to say that much as there wasn't mention of circular economy in the outcomes, there was a lot of work that was mentioned, especially loss and damage. There is a lot of inroads on circular economy as a solution. I've had circular economy being mentioned as a tool. It is a very strategic tool. You mentioned, Wanjira, on the closing window, that we have 7 years to go to meet the SDGs, to the NDCs, most of them point to 2030. So that's a very critical midpoint in terms of addressing the crisis that we have, which is climate. And all the other ones related, I mean, conflict and post-COVID recovery. So, yes, the outcomes, big tick on loss and damage. What was, I'm from a development bank, the African Development Bank. What was very critical for us was the message that was underlying about how we do our business. I sat and listened to the young entrepreneurs, very inspiring, on their stories about how they do business. I think that's a message that needs to get to our boardrooms, to our donors, and to how we move businesses. I mean, we see it where I come from. We say we're going to move $25 billion as climate finance to 2025. And if I were to speak to any of the panelists in the earlier panel and mention that figure, they'd be like, where is that money? And I think the message was very clear at COP that there has to be a shift on how MDBs do business. What does that mean? That means that if our shareholders are sending that message, then it will be easier for us to move from the traditional way we do business to getting business that makes the innovations that we had today from the gentleman who's doing low-cost housing to the woven textile solutions to the lava and worms in regenerating soils. So those businesses need to find an open door with where the big money is. So de-risking private capital is very critical, and speaking to the grassroots. At the bank, we have innovations such as youth entrepreneurship facilities. Those are mostly donor-funded. Now, we want that it's not just donor-funded, it's actually shareholders-funded. That the banks, our shareholders start to get this message. Two things I picked at COP was speed and scale. So as we speak here, let's see how we move the needle on speed and scale. So lastly, I was invited to speak on the Africa NDC Hub. Maybe many in the audience might not know what an Africa NDC Hub is or what an NDC Hub is. The NDCs are nationally determined contributions, which are commitments that all our countries have made. The whole of Africa has signed on to the Paris Agreement. That is big tick on political leadership. Now, what needs to be done is how do we make this happen? These are supposed to be roadmaps. These are supposed to be vision documents. But when you read in most NDCs, you cannot really operationalize it. They are not costed. They are not targeted. So that is the work that has to be done. And as we speak today around circular solutions, you will barely find circular solutions in those. But you'll find waste-to-energy projects, you'll find water harvesting, you'll find innovations around food systems that you mentioned. So we need to find the right language that captures what we are trying to say. In a way, you talked of indigenous knowledge and indigenous solutions, that all that is captured, that it's no longer too academic for the private sector to engage, for the common man to feel their part of. Because if you go in our markets, you're going to find a lot of circular solutions, but they don't brand them as such. And when they don't brand them, they can't, the narrative isn't right for the bank to finance, you lose the scheme. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Davina, thank you. And thank you for highlighting the huge success and probably the momentum that was set on MDBs, the attention on MDBs and the flows of finance, the quality, the velocity, but also the fact that it would open that door for other finance flows from IFIs. So that's really important. And we know that there was a report that showed that MDBs could actually do more. Even at their current risk levels, they're not doing enough. So that was a very big one. Adriana, I want to turn to you because a lot of recommendations have been presented. I want to hear some of your thoughts from COP.
First, let me thank you a lot for the invitation, and on behalf of UN Environment Programme, to thank the government of Rwanda, the government of Finland, the African Circular Economy Alliance, and CITRA for the organization of this new edition of the forum. I think it's wonderful to be in Africa, to be here, Africa for the world, analyze the opportunity for leapfrogging. Now, my takeaways of COP, and looking at the pool here. The question is always, how do we see the glass? Half empty, half full. And I tend to be optimist and see, okay, half full. Mm-hmm. Key things that we achieve. I think what was very clear in this COP was climate justice and to keep alive this limit of 1.5 degrees. And I think in that we did okay. Key outcomes is, of course, the agreement in establishing the Lost on Damage Fund. That's crucial, in particular for developing countries or countries that are more vulnerable, that have contributed very little for climate. So the challenge will be how the fund will be operationalized, the funding coming there. A second one, I think, is the call of the UN Secretary General of the the Climate Solidarity Pact, really calling again for developed and emerging countries to come together in more implementation and sharing resources. And looking at Africa, I think we saw again the leadership. I think the leadership of the continent, and with Egypt launching the global initiative of waste 50 by 2050. What does it mean? Is that the waste produced in Africa, 50% has to be treated by 2050. And I think this is key for circular economy. I hope we will have a grand potential to bring in circularity and also look at the waste prevention and not only treatment. On the half-empty glass, of course, we did not go as far as we wanted, and we hope. We see that we are very far away from the long delayed promise of $100 billion per year for finance climate, so we are far. Yet we saw over 10 billion new pledges. We also saw that we left COP without a clear timeline on the phase out fossil fuels. And once again, UNEP, civil society, youth, send the message of emergency. We are seeing this in Pakistan, in Brazil now. We saw the droughts in Kenya, here, etc. And the call for action. And this is really based on science. We launched there the UNEP's emission gap report and the adaptation gap report. And I think the message is clear. And Davina mentioned the title of our emission gap report is the closing window. We have very little time and we cannot afford to lose that. What is really calling here, Wanjira, is that we need a wide system transformation. And the opportunity here for circular economy, for us pushing for this, what we see is that if we really mainstream circular economy together with the policies for climate, for renewable energy transition, for energy efficiency, we can keep and reach the goals of 1.5 degrees. We know that if we focus in 5 key sectors, and we heard it in the last panel, construction, food, textiles, electronic, and the fifth one, mobility, we can reduce the carbon footprint by 60% and nature footprint by 80%. But here, the question is how we will do. And my last message, also emerging from our report, is a warning and a concern for us. If we look at the current policies, we are aiming at 2.8 degrees rise by the end of century, and we cannot afford that. The new pledges and the NDCs today will just help to reduce it to 2.4. This is not enough, so I stop here.
Adriana, thank you. You mentioned something that a lot of people, I'm sure, in this room are thinking about. This idea of leapfrogging is one that is quite constant. Is it real? Is it not? And what are the real opportunities, especially in the renewable energy sector? Because there are concerns, and it would be good to hear your thought. There are those who say, actually don't talk about leapfrogging for Africa because look at the cost of capital. Look at the lack of technology, etc., etc. What are the real opportunities for a leapfrogging for Africa?
Okay, I love this. And I'm always promoting leapfrog, but I heard once, to leapfrog, you need legs. And that's the thing. We saw it. There is innovation. I love it in the previous panel when they say circular economy is not new for Africa. That's how we were doing. That's the previous... I'm also from Latin America, and I also see that in our culture we have these solutions. But we now are embedded in this linear economy. So how will be the transition? We heard it. It's finance, it's technology, but it's also the investment in scaling up these beautiful solutions that they are bringing, that they are showing that are possible, but how can we then make it the norm? That is not the nice pilot project, but how can then, the important here is not only finance, it's the regulatory framework. How are we going to make policies to really force that every single restaurant cannot throw away food? That every single food waste, cannot go to the landfills. I know Europe has already these policies. Can we bring them here? Can we then see the opportunity that we will have in creating green jobs? And that's something I also want to highlight. And the COP27, UNEP, together with the ILO, International Labour Organization, and UNICEF, will launch it's a Green Jobs for Youth Pact. If we are talking about innovation, and we are really looking at this economic and society transformation towards circularity or sustainable development, we need high innovation. But do we have the necessary skills? Are we equipping the young people with the skills that they will have to move to renewable, regenerative agriculture, modular construction, etc.? So now another investment that we need to look is in the education system, is looking if we are equipping the new generations with the necessary skills.
Brilliant, Adriana. Thank you very much. I want to come to you, Davina. It raises the point that you made about the aspiration of NDCs and the need to ground them, therefore, in national action. We know that as we move into adaptation, this is going to be singularly important. The role of private sector in that.
It's very fundamental, and I think we didn't do justice trying to kind of separate NDCs from national development plans. And what that created was that there would be financing for NDCs, and then there would be financing for your usual national development plans. We know how to do or finance and budget for national development plans because we've done it for a very long time as speaking for government. Now, when it came for NDCs, they mostly came from ministries of environment. It could be quite a struggle trying to find in the ministries of finance people who understand how to budget for nature. And because of that, there was a lost opportunity in trying to ground innovations that would create that scale and speed in through the national budget to implementation. And that's what is being corrected today. That in the revision of NDCs, that we see the harmony between national planning for development and NDCs as a seamless process. Because for the longest time, there was wait for donor money to come and fund NDCs, and the NDCs had conditional attributes that will reduce emissions if we have this as additional finance coming in. And that has lost us time in trying to plan seamlessly how we do development. Because if you put up a road and that road is going to be washed away, the finance that comes in first is actually national budget. Mm-hmm. And that is supposed to be adaptation. So there's not adaptation that comes from EU. It is national budget that comes at the forefront. And so naming those and trying to put that as leverage, because most times it's like, with the African countries, there's not much of a leverage, private sector. If you come to this country, the private sector in this country is actually the de-risking force. Mm. They have the right perception of risk in terms of how to do business. If they're doing business, then there's something that is right. And that should be the litmus test. But if you're reading the risk profiles of the rating agencies, they're using different standards, different parameters, and that has to change. And all that changes in trying to get the right diagnostic through the NDCs that speak to the national planning, so that you have a seamless process through the ministries that are responsible for the narratives and the metrics, but really pulled together into the planning and the budget ministry, so that when you're financing for the road, you remember that there's resilience to be built. And that is into the total cost of that infrastructure. So at the back, we are actually trying to put up what is called the Africa Green Infrastructure Fund to kind of build resilience into the infrastructure. That is through what is called the Africa 50. The Africa 50 is an African fund for high infrastructure. So most times, when you look at our climate change portfolios, they seem to be technical assistance-based. But really, it cuts across the whole portfolio, your agricultural sector, your energy sector, is all about how resilient it is. So greening our economies is very critical. So the indices are not supposed to be separate documents. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, that wraps it up very nicely, because you mentioned the point that African leadership should be applauded. I found that we are spending 5% of GDP on adaptation already, while losing 15%. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for that, Davina. We have a minute and a bit, and so I want to turn back to you with your final reflection, and maybe just to see what gives you hope moving forward from 27. We will stop discussing the takeaways from COP27 and start looking into COP28, I'm sure. But what gives you hope, and what must we do?
Okay. Examples like the ones we heard. And also, I would say two things. Again, looking at the pool that we got today, I think little by little, governments are starting to mainstream more the approaches of circularity in the NDCs, for example. And the other one, and I'm happy to see in your report from this session, is the importance of highlighting the shift to consumption patterns. We often tend to look at the production, but we ignore also the potential and the importance of changing also the consumer. And we heard it in the fashion, for example, really looking, in quick wins that we will have, in the awareness raising or in the behavior change, in the food we are eating or wasting, is that locally grown or not, in the textiles, fashion that we are, wearing, all these issues that we heard there. The mobility, are we enforcing private car versus public? So I think the behavior change is important, but it's important to get this myth, I will say, that is about awareness raising and education. No, citizens need to have the enabling conditions that will then allow them to adapt or to move to our sustainable lifestyle, so circularity. If you don't have public transport, how are you going to leave your car? If you don't have healthy food, how are you going to stop eating the other right? No? So the infrastructure, the innovation there is important.
I see time is up, Adriana, and
yes,
I want
and
to
the last one, just to say, I'm very happy, the other one, just to show to all of you, and Davina talk about the NDCs. We are launching with UNDP a new tool, a toolbox online to support governments in mainstreaming circularity in the NDCs. And this is really what is important to say, in how can they not duplicate and do another policy in the NDCs? How can we then increase the ambition by integrating the circular economy approaches?
Wonderful. Thank you, Adriana. I want to give Davina a chance to give us your hope as we tee up the video from Isabella coming up.
Yeah, my last word is on debt. You mentioned the 50% of GDP that the most vulnerable countries have to incur when we have climate impacts. 9 of 10 most vulnerable countries are in Africa. They are the most indebted, the most low-income countries. So something about managing debt. We are now innovating with debt-to-nature swaps as innovations around trying to put circular financing on the table for the most vulnerable. And I saw at COP language coming in on grant-based adaptation. Mm-hmm. It's very, very critical that we decouple debt from financing climate. And then lastly, at the African Development Bank, we are also for the first time having a climate action window tied onto our Africa Development Fund, which is low concessional financing for low-income countries. That is fundamental. Unless we can push cheap finance, this will all be conversation. Thank you.
Grant-based adaptation finance, and we need legs to leapfrog. Thank you very much, ladies. Give them a round of applause. Thank you very much, Davina. Thank you. We're going to have a video now, a video message from Isabella Teixeira. She wasn't able to join us, so take it away.
Hello, I'm Isabella Teixeira, co-chair of the International South Panel. I'm really very happy and honored for your invitation to give a video address to the World Circular Economy Forum. Greetings to you all in Kigali. I'm so pleased to see resource use solutions for climate and also biodiversity centralized in your agenda. Now it's time to realize the huge potential of resource-efficient and circular economy. Resource solutions have particular power because they are tangible, touchable, and we can see all and feel resource in a way that it's impossible for carbon, for example. As a co-chair of the UNEP's International Resource Panel, I can share the science on how resource use is driving the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Our extractions and processing of natural resources cause 90% of global biodiversity loss, around 50% of climate change impacts, and a third of health-related pollution impacts. RIP scenarios modeling tell us that if we don't make far-reaching change, global material extraction and all its environmental impacts will triple before 2060. So we can also see the unequal distribution in who benefits from resource extractions. Factoring in trade, we can see that the material footprint on the average person in a high-income country is 13 times greater than the average citizens in a low-income country. The science is clear. If you don't change our resource use partners, the global community's climate and biodiversity targets will stay out of reach. The message comes from the other intergovernmental science platforms, not just International Resource Panel. IPCC's latest Working Group 3 report on mitigation centralized the role of material solutions. The IPPS Global Assessment on Biodiversity offers similar messages. At COP27, all three scientific panels came together in an event hosted by the German government. We all gave a clear shared message. Governments need to leverage the full power of systemic resource solutions in our national climate and biodiversity plans. The Global South can really lead the way. Imagine the power of mega biodiverse countries using resource use science to develop sustainable biomass economies. This is one example, and we have another one because we have alternatives, and we need to address better our singularities as Global South countries. So we have a great opportunity to harness the full potential. I hope the World Circular Economy Forum and your dialogue in this session contributes to that opportunity. Thank you, and I wish you all the very best for a successful event.
Thank you, Isabella. That was a wonderful message. Resource use patterns must change, and our next panel knows a lot about that. I want to invite up on the stage Kari Hellevy. He's the head of global collaboration at CITRA. And then, of course, Maxwell Gomera, who's the resident rep for UNDP. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can come.
In between?
Yeah, you sit here, then I can turn. Great. Well, we established, I think, that adaptation and biodiversity are central tools and circularity plays a great role in that. And I think this panel is going to do justice to this. I want to start by letting you say something first. So, Kali, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Very inspirational day already, so very honored to be here in the panel as well. I think it has been well said that, of course, nature is the basis of all life, but sometimes we forget that we need nature for making products and services as well, and at the same time we are really destroying nature and using the natural capital. So, and the kind of measure so far has been to protect nature, and that's of course crucial, but it hasn't been enough, and for those reasons we need to expand our toolkit really and integrate circular economy in these discussions. Like Isabel Teixeira just mentioned about the role of extraction and processing of materials towards biodiversity loss. So we have to look at the global level also, how to reduce the use of materials. And because it's a systemic problem, so if we can just focus in one region, the problem will shift to elsewhere. So in that sense, That's crucial. But the second is that, of course, we need materials for the green transition, for example. And in that sense, we need to have circular economy in a toolkit. And of course, we know what kind of solutions there are. But the one thing that I'd like to also mention that the discussion has been too much focused on technical cycles. So the biological cycles needs to be in the core of the discussions. Like we all know the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's butterfly diagram with the biological cycles. So we have to think about how we grow food and how we make products from the biomass, for example, so that we actually give back to nature more than at the moment. And this year, we have done at Citra Tackling Root Causes report. If you haven't read it, please do that, because it makes clear kind of connections between circular economy and biodiversity, and how to really strengthen biodiversity in a quantitative manner. We had Vivid Economics from Das Gupta reports modelers working with us, and the key message is really that we can halt and even reverse biodiversity loss by 2035 to 2000 levels. So there is positive outcomes possible.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you very much for teeing that up. And Maxwell, I want to turn to you. Maybe you would address a little bit some of the pressures that come from the development agenda already on biodiversity.
Thank you. And I want to pick up on the very inspiring session that we had early this morning. Hustlenomics. How did you even come up with that name? Where is he? I loved it. You know, but even for those of us who are a step removed from nature in our present-day lives, looking back at the places that we call home, or that we called home as we were growing up, can reveal very disturbing truths. That is certainly true for me. I grew up in a small mining town in Zimbabwe called Kadoma. And as soon as school was done, my parents would bundle me off to Mondoro, a rural area to the south. And there I herded cattle across the quintessential untamed African savanna. You know how that feels? Nice. I loved being in Mondoro. In its rivers, I learned to swim and to catch fish. The surrounding forests were lush green, teeming with wildlife, and the rivers were bountiful, full of fish. And the pure fresh water was something that stays with me in my mind. As a city folk, I went to the rural area and came back with my hands full, because nature was able to give. Today, my village in Mondoro is heartbreaking. The lush forests and wildlife are gone. They have all been replaced with dry fields. The river is dry, and I now take my own food and bottled water when I'm going to my village. And worst of all, the people who live in that village are very poor, and there are very few, if any, options for bettering their lives. Now, tragically, the story of my village is not just unique to Zimbabwe. It is the story of villages right across Africa that are suffering the worst impacts of climate change, of population growth, now COVID, and the war in Ukraine. How worse can it get? The development choices that we make henceforth are important for their future. The good news is that the outcomes like those in my village are not inevitable. We can do something about it. And this conversation today, I'm excited for it because I want to hear how we can explore what we can do about it in 3 fields that I think have potential. The first one is, how do we finance the transition that's needed, whether it's in circular economy or transition to a green economy? It is not cost neutral. The second is, how do we ensure technology is available? And third, how do we empower the conversations that are needed to make discussions like this dinner time stories for every family and to shape the dreams and hopes of every African and everyone in the world?
Thank you. Thank you, Maxwell. Yeah. Thank you, Maxwell. 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 Thank you, Max Maxwell, you paint a picture of wonder and beauty, which I recognize and I hear from so many people who grew up in those circumstances. But you also replace that with a sense of progress that destroys all of that. What does sustainability look like in that world? How ought we be doing our development differently? What does that transition look like going forward? Can you reflect a little bit on what you would like to see?
Yes. I think a starting point is to have a common reference point on what's the problem we're trying to solve here. A few weeks ago, I visited a young woman who is in a district called Huye. And the young woman started a business around waste management and treatment. She's producing fertilizer now that is of global standard, and she can export it to anywhere. She hires 32 people, and she has now started producing pavement bricks from plastic waste. A week ago, I bumped into another young woman who is producing strawberries from hydroponic systems, saving 98% of water that she would have used by doing other things. Now, these stories tell us that the possibilities are there and it can happen. And actually, the government of Rwanda has committed to a greener, inclusive, and more resilient transformation. As UNDP, we take that as given. What we do want to work with government and with all of you on are the rules of the game. Why is it that when the young woman who's running a hydroponic business walks into a bank, she is told this is not bankable? Bankable is not a law of physics. It's something that we create, the rules we create around doing business. And that's what we need to focus on and change.
Lovely. Kari, yes. Yes, appreciate Maxwell. Thank you. Kari, I wanted to turn to you because I really like what you said about the fact that we spend so much on technical cycles and not so much on biological cycles. And food is at the center of that. And on the African continent, when we are discussing food systems transformation, you know how contentious this issue is. There's so many opinions and corners to food systems transformation. What should we be thinking about when we look at circularity or our food systems in a way that is sustainable, that drives the sort of vision you would like to see?
It's a very good question, and of course, we are not experts in the African context, to be fair, but through our work with the Tackling Root Causes report, of course, we also look at the global situation, especially about the agricultural sector, and 50% of the habitable land is really used for agriculture and pasture, so of course making food as well. And as you mentioned in the opening, Wanjira, it has of course a lot of emission impacts and biodiversity as well. But I think the good news here is that it's also part of the solution. So it's certainly possible to drive nature-positive agricultural sector globally. And one of the key areas that we identified was regenerative agriculture, which could actually have a 10% positive impact in biodiversity. And in fact, that should be the mainstream of agriculture sector internationally. And one of the reasons is that you could also, of course, reduce the use of fertilizers, even 30%. And there are studies like IUCN showing also from the African context that you could actually use that regenerative principles to repair degradable land and really have a soil management that supports that. And I was really fascinated by the Footprints Africa case examples. There was one that really keeps in my mind, which is the Oko forest in Ghana. And there was also in the morning discussion that we should have enabling environment. And I think this case is interesting in that perspective, that it has a connection to biodiversity, but I didn't know that there could be a connection to blockchain technology as well. And in this case, the problem is that the farmers can't prove that they own the land. And if they don't own the land, it is not so easy to actually improve the biodiversity and the soil management. And with the blockchain technology, that could be possible. So I think we need to have these kind of examples. I'm sure that these kind of problems are also elsewhere as well. But the regenerative is only one thing. We also have to look at the food waste, which is the low-hanging fruit, and a reduction of 50% of food waste should be essential in our mind. We think about like health effects of food, but really we need to reduce the food waste in order to use the food. And also the third one is the consumption part. So it's also good to look at how much meat we are using. Could we actually reduce the use of meat internationally as well, and dairy products? And those could actually free up a lot of land from agricultural purposes. So I think these are the kind of elements that we have to look not only in Africa but elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Kari. And I just wanted to follow up on the point you made, especially about dietary shifts. There's so much said about the fact that nutrition is such an important part of the African development agenda at the moment, and while the message in some parts is about reducing consumption, in other parts it's about increasing consumption of dairy, of meat, especially for children under 5. What's your perspective on that?
Well, if I think about internationally, I think certainly reducing meat is important, and dairy. To my understanding, in Africa, the consumption of meat is in a sustainable level already. So I would put more emphasis on the sustainable production methods instead of thinking like the whole value chain here. So I think you are more advanced in this perspective.
Thank you, Kari. I didn't pay Kari to say that, but that's what I wanted to hear. But I want to turn to you, Maxwell, the reality of how we are developing and what's going on. For Africa, I believe that vulnerability, we know, is the number one driver of poverty, and of course adaptation speaks to that. The fact that for us adaptation is about economic development. Some people don't like it when we say it's about economic development for Africa. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I don't see a contradiction between development and doing the right thing for environment. I do see a lot of opportunity, actually. Those countries that have decided to create a false dichotomy between the two are paying the price. We could make the choice that transition to a green economy or a circular economy is a tax on our development. That's a choice, but it's rolling a dice on our life. The evidence out there is showing that actually investments in green energy is creating more jobs than any other industry. And here in this country, we have a problem. Not just in this country, but across the continent. World over, we are losing, or in 2019, we're losing a football pitch-sized area of tropical forest every 6 seconds in 2019. The same size pitch in which Brazil thrilled us last night. Wasn't that great? But that is tragic. And it's even more tragic across this continent, in this country where land is at a premium, where we also need to create space for wildlife and ecosystem services that we need. But it is not inevitable by improving the way we produce our food systems. Right. I talked about hydroponic systems. Improving the productivity of agriculture on this continent. It is unacceptable that smallholder agriculture on this continent is 20% of global average. That's something we can solve. Better agronomic practices, better seeds, access to finance. We can do it. So it's just unacceptable that we are facing these outcomes that are within the realm of our control.
Thank you, Maxwell. We can do it. And I really like that message because we do. And I think the food sector has such a great opportunity in that vein. I want to turn to you, Kari, for perhaps your closing reflections rolled into your thought. What gives you hope about this sector in food systems, the opportunity for circularity? Where is it going in this next few years, in the decade?
I think one thing that comes to my mind from the hope perspective is we had a Time magazine visiting Finland last year, and we were thinking that where to actually direct them, and one place was the kindergarten. And in those discussions, when the reporter asked the children that, what is circular economy, they said that they want to have long-lasting products and toys that last longer. But if I take that to the food system, I think there's a similar transformation happening in different parts of the world, that more sustainable produced food is really appreciated. And I think we all can agree that good quality food is something that we are after here. And in that sense, I think that's one. And the second is that so many innovations happening in the food sector now, and some of them are highlighted here in the seminar as well.
Thank you, Carrie. How about you, Maxwell? What gives you hope?
You know, by adopting a circular economy, we can safeguard the hopes and dreams of generations who deserve a chance to live out their dreams. When I think of the farmers that I was talking about in Mondoro, they are not unreasonable. They are people who are trying to make a living. But in doing so, they are clearing up more land, bringing their families into dangerous contact with wildlife. We can change that. We just need to make the investments into improving the productivity of agriculture on this continent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The truth of the matter is circular economy is a crucial tool in building adaptive capacity, in protecting biodiversity. I'm always struck by the reality that Africa is a mega diverse continent. We have the healthiest lung of the planet right here on the African continent, the mighty Congo forest. And yet today it is at risk. It is at risk because we haven't yet placed the value of that forest centrally in our economic models. And the more we go into the new thinking, the new circularity models, is to begin to bring in the realities of all of these, the value of all of this mega diversity that is right here on the continent, and food a central part of that. Thank you both, gentlemen. Maxwell, Carrie, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And our last conversation is with none other than the State Minister of Environment from Finland. And I'm really excited about this because Terry, we get to discuss everything we've had. Terry Lehtinen, come up.
Thank you so much.
So good to see you. Thank you, Terry. I'll let you reflect a little bit on what you've heard and give me some of that, and then we can go from there.
Well, thank you. Thank you. First of all, let me, through you, thank the government of Rwanda for hosting and allowing us to take part in this wonderful forum here in Africa this year. And very pleased that we can meet live and that we can have this focus on Africa. I think it's been a brilliant conversation until now, and I just would want to stress that how we can learn from each other. I think we're having similar conversations, but we see that we can exchange best practices and we can learn from each other. And I think this applies to Global North and Global South, and we all need to be finding solutions together.
Terry, thank you. There's something I know you care deeply about, and that's action. Because at the end of the day, we heard earlier that NDCs, all of these ambitious plans, they come down to country-level action. Share a little bit about what you think about integrating climate biodiversity at the country level.
Well, what we do in Finland, first of all, climate has been a big priority to... We take our commitment under Paris Agreement very seriously. So our climate science panel has advised to us what is consistent for Finland to be in line with Paris Agreement 1.5 degree commitment. And we have set that climate neutrality. That means for us climate neutrality by 2035 and being carbon negative or climate positive thereafter. We have set that in law, and we have put in place greenhouse gas reduction targets that are aligned with that approach. And we have the policies and measures. We work very hard at looking at nitty-gritty of each sector, and we have sorted it out what we need to do. On biodiversity, we have a further way to go. We have, in the past few years, increased our funding for nature conservation and for nature restoration quite a bit. And we are expecting very strong results from Montreal for the global biodiversity framework. And we are already in the process of setting those goals into our domestic strategy. And to come back to circular economy is our tool to address both climate and the biodiversity crisis. And we have also a new circular economy strategy that we have, where we have for the first time also put quantitative targets on our nature or natural resource consumption and efficiency. So we work through these programs, and it's been a core of this work.
Now, that's great to hear that, because two of the things that came up in the dialogue before and in the first one were finance. Finance features so strongly, quality of finance, velocity of finance. There's the real Achilles heel of how we move forward, and especially then with loss and damage, this idea of data, the data gap. What are your thoughts about how we bridge both of those gaps as we move forward?
Well, that's correct. Also, the access to finance is also a key enabler for us in our economy. So, for example, we have in our COVID-19 recovery program, we decided to dedicate at least half of those funds to direct climate action and greening the economy and digital transformation. So most of those resources are accelerating our transformation towards a circular, carbon neutral economy. But I think this is also an area where the international community and multinational development banks that was in the previous discussion very rightly said, I think in both discussions, both panels, that we need to ensure that there is access to finance. I know that an entrepreneur in Finland has a very different interest rate in Finland than a Rwandan entrepreneur or an African company. So I think this is where we need to work together to de-risk, to find those instruments to make sure that finance is there.
Indeed, and I think that's also why so many people are excited about the fact that there's new pressure on MDBs to do better, because I think that without the velocity and scale of finance, we heard scale and speed as key elements of the first session, we really cannot bridge the gap that's needed. We are going to hear shortly from the wonderful Minister of Environment from Rwanda, Dr. Jean-Jacques Mujawamariya. Before she comes up, I just wanted to ask you, Terry, what gives you hope as we move forward into this year and every year after this becoming so critical? What must we do better?
Well, I think what gives me hope is this kind of events and the entrepreneurs that were on stage earlier, and the kind of energy that we see also in Finland, and the kind of recognition, also the way innovation has led. We have the solutions around, so that it's now up to politicians like the minister and ourselves to put the economy on track, make the right decisions, and I think the tools are available. And we have the think tanks, the research organizations that are putting forward the measures and the tools, and it's now a time to act.
Thank you very much. And you and I will sit here very comfortably, and we're going to welcome Dr. Jean-Jacques Mujawamariya. She's the wonderful Minister of Environment from Rwanda. We're very honored, our host here today. Dr. Mujawamariya, I'll let you use the podium up there with some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, my sister Matai. Excellencies, ministers, dear Katainen, Sitra President, Excellencies, members of Diplomatic Corps, Excellencies, members of Parliament, distinguished guests, my brother, UNDP resident representative, Max, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you once again for this session. This has been a rich discussion on how circular approaches can address climate change and stem biodiversity loss. These rights are not being sacred to me. It is in all corners of the world we owe our way of life to the diverse ecosystem services offered by nature. I'm sorry. Can you help me with the rights, please? Still. Okay. I remove my specs. So degradation of natural ecosystems and the subsequent loss of biodiversity are detrimental to our well-being and economic development. When we add the impacts of climate change, the livability of our planet is at risk. To counter that unthinkable scenarios, we must put circularity, climate change, and biodiversity at the heart of our policies, strategies, programs, and projects. In Rwanda, we are working across the government to integrate these three themes into national policies and strategies, district development strategies, and sector strategic plans. When all institutions consider the environment and climate change in their annual plans and budget, we will be better able to achieve our goal of being a carbon neutral and climate resilient nation by 2050. In Rwanda, across the continent and around the world, we need to build synergies between the circular economy and climate actions. We have a unique opportunity to build on the outcomes from COP27 and call for greater ambition and specific targets at the upcoming COP15 on biodiversity. These efforts can be both underpinned and empowered by a virtual circular economy. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, by pairing the circular economy with climate action and nature-based solutions, there is also the huge potential for green job creation. That is because sustainable land management and landscape restoration, such as terracing and tree planting, require a huge workforce. In addition, innovative circular economy ideas can also generate new businesses that employ many people in both casual and permanent jobs. However, implementing the circular economy, addressing climate change, and hurting biodiversity loss is not a one-person task. It requires working together. All stakeholders, including the public sector, private sector, civil society organizations, and development partners need to be at the table. We also need evidence-based decisions supported by reliable data. This can only be achieved by ensuring the generation and availability of relevant and usable data, as well as by enhancing research collaborations across borders. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let us join forces and integrate circularity and nature-based solutions in our development process and realize our climate mitigation and adaptation potentials. This discussion today has shown that integrating the circular economy into our development can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reverse the loss of biodiversity, and enhance our adaptation capacity. However, it is also important to note that achieving this progress relies on adequate financial resources. Governments need to streamline domestic resources to achieve these crucial milestones for sustainable development and mobilize external resources to cover the gap. This requires new and innovative global financing mechanisms. I wish to close my remarks by expressing our gratitude to the organizers of these important sessions and to all of you who intervened. Your contribution to advancing the circular economy, addressing climate change, and hurting biodiversity loss is greatly appreciated. Just now we opened and we launched our Rwanda National Circular Economy Action Plan. And from that place, we took decision. Each and everyone here, with these coming festive seasons, we have to buy what we need, not what we want. From now on. Because most of the time we buy what we want, and we arrive home, we don't use it. So it's better we buy what we need, not what we want, for these coming festive seasons. So let us work as a team and strengthen our partnerships and collaboration to ensure success, sustainable development, and build a better future we want for our children and grandchildren. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister, and for that really wonderful those closing remarks, and also reminding us to revise our holiday lists, not to have what we want, but what we need. How does one sum up, Terry, such a rich discussion out of a mixed outcome that we saw in the beginning as we started from the COP discussion and what we thought and how we felt buoyed, but also some of the really elevating discussion that came out of this, the fact that there's so much African leadership, first of all, acknowledging that and investing in adaptation, and the fact that adaptation is such an important part of that. We heard about speed and scale. We heard about systems transformation. We heard that we need legs to leapfrog, climate solidarity. We heard a lot about
the circularity in biodiversity, in climate, that circularity is climate action and has to be at the heart of policy and how we move forward. We need to expand our toolkits. So many nuggets today. I just want to say thank you to everybody, and particularly to our hosts and the ministers here. So thank you so much to Rwanda for hosting us. And thank you, Terry, for a wonderful discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps a round of applause for our moderator, please, for an excellent job. Thank you so much, Wanjira. My job is really simple now. One, it's to highlight the accelerator sessions that on the back of this conversation you might really be keen on. Remember, you can see all of this on your app. But just to highlight, there is a session on circular economy adoption. There is a session on circular economy in action and really looking at the metrics that we're using and the extent to which we're making progress in the right direction. There's a session on a global roadmap towards the circular economy that you might be interested in. And of course, there is a session that speaks to one of the key points we heard in this conversation, and that is food systems being at the center. So we have a lot to choose from. Make sure that you're plugging in and you're not missing out on those sessions. We are now ready for us to take a very well-deserved lunch break. So a couple of announcements from me. We are all going to the first floor, which is the Soko restaurant, for lunch. However, if you have a yellow dot on your badge, you would be guided down to kindly please go to B1, which is one level below, and that's where lunch is going to be served. There are ushers waiting to guide you, and the rest of us will go one level up to the Soko restaurant to have lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, coming up after lunch is a very, very important session on circular trade and value chains, and my humble request of all of you is that we might be back in the room ready at 14:40, which gives us more than an hour for lunch and ensures that we're bang on time for our virtual audience who are all in the same conversation with us. I'll see you straight after lunch at 14:40.